Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. My name is Alan Fadling, and I invite you to listen to leadership conversations that will help you to develop healthy rhythms of rest and work, and to live fuller in friendship with God. I hope this podcast will help you to overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. On today's Unhurried Living Podcast, I'm pleased to have James Bryan Smith, author of The Good and Beautiful You. Jim, thanks so much for having this conversation with me.
Well, Alan, I am delighted. We've known each other for several years now, and
yes,
feel like we're kindred spirits and interested in the same things. God's designed us for good things to do together, and we have the same hairstyle, which is...
Yes, I've joined you in that hairstyle, and I appreciate you leading the way.
Yes.
And yeah, I feel very much the same way. I'm so grateful for your voice. I've so enjoyed the writings God's given you. I think they're such a ministry to the wider community, and I'm grateful for them too.
Oh, thank you.
Well, so I always love to start a conversation about a book by asking the author, if in this case you happen to be that person, would you share a little of the story of your journey in coming to write this book?
Yeah, well, so this book is the fourth book in a series, and I had finished the trilogy, the first three books, back in 2012. So they came out in 2009, 2010, 2011. And I thought, well, I'm done with that. And the books were having a lovely ministry and life of their own, and even in other countries. And I happened to be in England, and I was with a friend of mine named Joe Davis, who's used the books, The Good and Beautiful God, Life and Community, used those books in ministry settings. And while we're having tea, because that's what they do in England,
yes,
over tea, Joe just says, well, you're missing one book in the series. And I thought, wow, that's bold to tell an author that.
Yeah.
3 years after the series had already been out. And I said, okay, what am I missing? And he said, The Good and Beautiful You. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, tell me why. And he said, The Good and Beautiful God really helps people with their toxic God narratives. There's a lot of bad God narratives out there. And he said, I found that book, more than any other book I've used, it really helps. And so that's huge.
Yeah.
But I've also discovered in the ministry time with people is that people have really toxic self narratives and who they are. And I resonated with that when he said that. I thought he's right, but I also wasn't ready to write that book. There's the old adage, when you're ready, the right teacher will find you. When you're ready, the right book will find you.
I think so.
And I think also when you're ready, the right book is there for you to write. And it wasn't the time. But a couple of years ago, I thought, I think I do need to write this book, and started working on it. And it was such a big subject. It was far and away the most difficult book for me to write. Because I just didn't know where I would go with it. I mean, I knew Joe was right. Many people have really bad narratives of who they are. Christians, right? So I thought, okay, I see the problem, but I don't see the through line of how to address it. And I started studying the works of a guy named Adrian von Kamm, who's a Catholic spiritual writer, late 20th century, phenomenal guy. I never met him, but I read his many books. And his theological anthropology, which is a fancy way of saying, who are we? Like, who is the human person? What are we? Really, it worked so nicely with Dallas Willard's theological anthropology in Renovation of the Heart. So I was able to look at those two things and see something. And then the idea about that we have this soul with these needs, and God is the answer to those needs, became the way to approach it.
Yeah, no, I love that so much. And you mentioned that sort of big phrase, big word, theological anthropology. And I remember reading right in the early part of your book, you talk about a conversation that, you had with Dallas about, the rise of the Christian formation movement and how exciting that is, how good that is. And then Dallas expressed a concern. And his concern was that with this rapid growth and rapid favor, maybe the movement wouldn't do the hard work of establishing, this anthropological foundation. I'd say a little bit more about that, because he was right, I think, in many ways. And he saw a potential downside if we didn't do that good work.
Yeah, exactly. So, of course, Dallas was there at the beginning when we started Renovare. And so in 1988, that ministry was brand new. Spiritual formation was a term that wasn't used. People didn't understand what we were. Fast forward, and, by around 2005, it had become commonplace for people to talk about spiritual formation. There were pastors of spiritual formation, right? Master's degrees, doctor of ministry programs. Spiritual formation became a part of the vernacular. And I asked Dallas, are you happy to see this? And he said, I am, but, and that's what you're alluding to, Alan, is his caution was that it had grown so fast that it would, if it didn't have a strong theological anthropological foundation, it would degenerate into legalism, was his exact phrase. I said, explain what that means. And he says, well, if you don't understand the nature of the human person, then you're going to put all the focus on the practice of the disciplines. And the disciplines then will become the central focus. And it's never been about the disciplines. The disciplines have never been the issue. It's ways to connect us to God. As Richard Foster so brilliantly said, the disciplines place us before God so that God can transform us. But the issue is not the disciplines. And Dallas was afraid that it would degenerate into technique, that it would become focused primarily on the practices. I think he was right, Alan, because I started noticing a few years back, many of the books that would come across my desk on spiritual formation were focused on practices. And now there's nothing wrong with that, right? I love that. If there's a book on prayer or fasting or solitude or silence, but what's the point? Why do we do those things? If we understand who we are, that's the theological anthropology. Yeah. Now I understand, why do I, like, for example, your incredible work in Unhurried Living. Why is that so important? In one sense, you don't need to know all the theological anthropology to read your books and put them into practice. It will change your life. That you see that. I've watched your ministry do that. One of my closest friends, when he read Unhurried Living, He's like, no book's changed me more, right? So it works whether or not you understand why.
Yeah.
But if you do understand why is that? Because we have a soul and we live at the speed of our soul.
Yes.
And a hurry is not soul speed.
No.
And so it's one thing to say, well, I need some techniques for margin and slowing down and creating space. But if you understand why, you're more likely not to put the focus on the practice. That's what Dowse was worried about.
Yeah, that's so good. And I have that experience. I'll have a leader come and they want to grow, they want to learn. And their first question is a question usually about practices. What should I do? Tell me what to do. It's like, give me a prescription and I'll do the thing and then we'll be all set. And my instinct is there's something before that. And that's what you're describing. It's like this, there's a vision of who I am. The theological anthropology is a way to label that, but there's a vision of who I am that you need so that the practices make sense. The practices are a way of living this life that we've been given, as opposed to, Dallas is concerned that they become another kind of legalism, an outward thing that I do thinking that I will achieve something, earn something, whatever it is.
Right. And without the right kind of God views and the right kind of self views, the practice of the disciplines may actually harm you. That's the scary thing. And that's what Jesus was attacking with the Pharisees, was they did the practices, but for all the wrong reasons. And when they fasted and prayed and gave alms, they were doing the practices, but their heart, they weren't doing it with the right inner intention. And therefore it went badly. Yeah.
Well, so right up front, you throughout, you're talking about true narratives and false narratives. That's been a theme I think that's really given you that helps us a lot. And early on, you talk about two common narratives about human reality. One is the narrative that I am a self, and the other is the narrative that I have a soul. And I wonder if you can help us understand the difference between these two visions of persons.
Well, it's a big one. So I kind of mark the beginning of the emergence of the self back to 1637, when Descartes published his discourse on method, which the famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. And right there in that, he was basically saying the center of knowledge, like how I know anything, is myself. I think, therefore I am. And so the I is at the center of that. And that moves us into modernity and now into postmodernity. And the 20th century becomes called the century of the self, because that's where you have, in the aftermath of Freud and Darwin and Marx, this view that reality is secular, that reality is, people aren't spiritual beings. They're selves. And you have a self, and that self then, by its nature, is in competition with other selves for survival. If it's Darwin and Nietzsche, right, and or yourself is who you are is your id, ego, superego. If it's Freud's view of the human person, his anthropology. So we see this in the 20th century, and the 20th century is also marked by the worst in human atrocities. It's a place where we dehumanize people, whether it was in concentration camps, dropping bombs, whatever. The 20th century becomes this place where the self is the center of reference for everything, and it just is pretty deadly, because we are souls. We are unceasing spiritual beings. And that's the essence of who I am is as a soul. A self is going to be naturally in competition. Like you, Alan, I'm your competition for me, right? You're a writer, you're whatever, who's selling more books, whose podcast is doing. Mm-hmm. That's a self. That's the self, or the flesh, Paul would call it. That's not who I look at you, my brother. You are a sacred soul. We are united. You and I are one. Your well-being is my well-being, and vice versa. And so shifting the point of reference away from self to soul is a big shift, and so much comes with it.
That's huge. I mean, that's, as you say, that's a massive global, I mean, it's just monstrous. And the impact on so many areas of our lives of that simple little shift of vision of who I actually am. And so as you continue the book, you frame it around what you call 10 needs that, every soul has. And in fact, you even describe the human soul as being rather needy. But you don't seem to see that as bad news. I think some of us hear that and go, "Oh no, I don't know if I want to have a needy soul." But talk some about that idea of just our souls really do have needs, quite a few of them.
They do, and and that was really, as I said earlier, the through line when I began to see the idea that we have a soul with built in. I kind of like to call it factory loaded, like it comes in a part of us as a person, these longings. And so, well, just to name a few, I mean, one thing is that we all desire to be desired. We want to be wanted. We, that feeling when you walk into a room and you think, I don't think I'm wanted here. It's terrible. Right? That hurts the soul. In contrast, when you walk into a space where it's, hey, Alan, everybody's excited to see you.
Totally.
It's a beautiful thing. And so to be wanted, to be desired is a fundamental human need. And we see the devastation when that doesn't happen, when a parent neglects or is abusive or didn't want the child, or what you see this on the playgrounds when the person gets rejected, doesn't get picked for the team, all those things that hurts the soul because that's a need that we have. We also, second, have a longing to be loved without condition, not loved for what I do, how I look, what I achieve, but someone who sees everything about us and loves us for who we are as we are. That's a deep need that's built into the human person. It's universal. It crosses race, gender, age, country. Everybody is the same. And then the third one is a longing for transcendence, is how I put it, which is a longing for God. We have to have a connection to something higher and bigger than us. And I believe that, well, it's Pascal's famous line, right? Where there's a God-shaped hole in the heart of every person that can only be filled by God. Or Augustine's famous quote, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. So that's a built-in longing and need of the soul, is to find rest in God, to find fulfillment in communion with God. So those are just three. Yeah. And I cover 10, in the book, to say these are things that we don't really get a choice. You need these things, just like your body needs air and food and rest and water and minerals and vitamins, and you don't have those, your body suffers. If you don't have these needs of the soul met, you will suffer.
And when those needs of the soul aren't met, we go to all kinds of other places to try and figure out how to get something that we intuitively know we need. And sadly, the other places we go rarely meet us there.
Exactly, they don't. I mean, that's the longing is there. I mean, I think, for example, if I just think about music, like pop music, one of the things that I started listening to music differently during the writing of the book, and the word soul is in so much music.
That's right, isn't it?
It is. But I mean, just think about, okay, the first thing I said, our soul, we want to be wanted. We desire to be desired. Remember that old song, I Want You to Want Me, from the Scottish band. What was their name?
Oh, gosh, I don't remember.
Oh, God. Anyway, yeah, I mean, that's in there. Or Rihanna sings, We Found Love in a Hopeless Place, or Steve Winwood sings, Give Me a Higher Love. In our music, we hear, because music is a lot about longing. We talk about soul music, soul food, soul mates. Yeah. We talk a lot about soul, but we really don't know, like, what is it? Yeah, that is so true. So music, they sort of got a feeling for this better than maybe some of us theologians have had in the past. The Bay City Rollers. There it is, Alan. There, thank you. That one out. That was from my side of the country too. Scottish, I should have remembered that. Yes. Anyway, well, and so as I continue through the book, maybe because this is the Unhurried Living podcast, I especially enjoyed reading this little line. You said,
I can think of no practice that is more needed for our frantic, fast-paced, overscheduled world than holy leisure. So I wonder if you could just talk some about that. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with Sister Joan Chittister, and she talked about holy leisure from sort of the Benedictine, description of it. But I would love to hear you describe what that practice has looked like for you and for those that you serve.
I first learned about holy leisure back in the 80s from Dallas, the late 80s, when we were starting Renovare. And essentially the practice is to do nothing that accomplishes something. Yeah. So because people are, what can I do? Well, anything as long as you're not trying to accomplish. It's being versus doing kind of thing. Yeah. And in its basic practice, it's just, I'm going to be still. I'm going to be present. I'm not going to, because people say, can I journal when I'm doing holy leisure? Yeah, if you're not accomplishing it. I mean, if you're writing a sermon or can I read the Bible? Yeah, but if you're doing it to gain something. So Dallas talked about that practice, and I said, okay, I think that's a pretty central practice. I'm going to put that in the original Renovare Spiritual Formation Workbook as a practice. And so Dallas saw my list of about 10 basic practices, and he looked at it and he said, holy leisure will be the hardest one for people. And I said, oh, no, it won't.
What could be easier?
Doing nothing.
Come
for
on.
15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever you can. He was absolutely right, because my test group, when we did it, everybody would come back week after week, and I'd say, so how did it go with holy leisure? And they'd go, yeah, well, I'm saying, how'd it go with your Bible reading? Oh, I nailed that. I read 5 chapters of Romans, but he said, could you just set aside 30 minutes to do nothing? Very hard for us to do, because it's the death to the self, right? Myself's in competition. Myself needs to be accomplishing, to be validating myself. So doing nothing is, and that's why the book starts out. That's the very first soul training exercise is holy leisure, for 2 reasons. One, to show you this is a need of your soul, because if it's death to the self, it's life to the soul. But also because it's an act of grace. Yeah, it's just kind of, I start the good and evil God out with sleep as a practice, because I want to say, this is not about you accomplishing. You do nothing, and you didn't do anything to get here. Right. That's one of the things, like you didn't merit your existence. So I want you to spend 20 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever you can do, just doing nothing. And it definitely does connect with the world and that you're in and what you teach about, Alan.
Well, I remember hearing that from Dallas, in the 80s, and that just became for me, it became a strategic practice. I realized I really believed, but we're back to theological anthropology. I really believed I was what I did. So if that's true, then I have to do more to keep being somebody important. And that's just a treadmill you can never, ever get off.
Right.
It's exhausting. Absolutely. And I think for some people, midlife is when you realize you just can't run fast enough on the treadmill, you just finally fall off of it, But I love this. I just think that, that practice has been what's helped me remember that I'm a soul and not a self. And so as we continue, you talked at one point about a common mistake that leaders make. And I resonated with this because I think a lot of leaders will recognize this too. You talked about the idea that maybe doing work for God was more important than caring for, your own soul. And I run into this idea of people almost imagining that the care of their soul is a luxury that they can't quite afford yet, as opposed to something absolutely essential that is underneath everything that they do. Can you unpack that a little more for us?
Well, preach it, brother. You nailed it. And it is a very common problem, because people, particularly leaders in ministry, are not exempt from that. And in many ways, we want to establish our value by all the things that we accomplish and do. And so we think, well, I'm in this to serve the Lord, so that's what's most important. I'm working for God here, and it's sad to see all the burnout and the moral failures that often are accompanied by burnout or caused by it. And I remember one minister, and I was talking about holy leisure and these practices, and he's like, it's not for me. He said, I'd rather burn out than rust out. And I was
gosh.
There's not only two choices here, bud.
Yeah, not just two. There are other possibilities.
There are other options than burn out or rust out. Because he was like, I can't just be idle. Well, there's ways to balance. But it's a common problem. And I write in the book about my own journey with that I got to a place where some things changed, and the pressures of ministry got very big and real for me. Richard Foster saw it coming. He's a mentor of mine, and Richard just warned me and said, you got to guard your soul. And I had no idea how prophetic he would be. And I got to that place, Alan, where I was there. It was actually success. I mean, it wasn't failure. It was success that caused me the most problems, because as things grew and expanded, the weight and pressure became more and more. And I started to neglect my soul. Like, well, I'm doing this great work right now. I don't need to be tending to those things that are important. But here's the reality. Your soul refuses to be ignored. These needs are real. You can try to neglect them. They will not be ignored. They will surface in other ways. And I'm grateful that it didn't get to a bad place for me. I was able to recognize it, see it coming, and do some good work for my soul. Yeah,
I just the more I talk with leaders, and I think maybe this is just the last 2 years of our experience with COVID and with some of the social realities that we're all kind of facing. It just feels like the volume has been turned up on these dynamics, especially for Christian leaders. They haven't always known that it was something about their soul, but I think their awareness that I need something is far louder than it was 2 years ago. I think what you've written speaks to where leaders are. I'm hoping that leaders will see that the care of their soul is not just something they do for their own sake, but for the sake of others too.
Yeah,
for the sake of the people they serve.
I'll tell you what, Alan. I several years ago, I prayed that God would give me opportunities to speak to ministers, to pastors, and boy, He answered the prayer. And I was privileged to lead a lot of retreats with pastors. And I opened all of these retreats. I did like 6 of them over a couple of years. I opened every one with this provocative statement, inflammatory statement. I would say, first thing out of my mouth, if you're not willing to care for your soul as your first priority, then please get out of the ministry.
Oh, man.
And, and that'll catch their attention. They're like, wait, what did he say? Yeah. But I really mean it. I mean, we minister out of that what we have, right?
That's exactly right.
We can't give what we don't ourselves have. And so I know that the only impact I've had positively in ministry is when I'm giving out of that life that I have. And if I don't tend to that, then I don't have anything to give.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, again, kind of coming back around to this question of identity for so many Christian leaders, their sense of identity is the thing I'm doing succeeding? Do people like it? Are the numbers getting bigger, whether it's people or dollars or whatever? But I love this line in your book, just so very simple, but I think profoundly so. If we're made in God's image, then we don't need to find our identity. Our identity will find us. That just sounds so different than the operating system that so many leaders seem to run by.
Yeah.
Can you just say more about that, the simplicity of that, but the invitation of that?
Yeah, it goes back to the very beginning. When we start with that I'm a self in competition, then we're all on an endless search for significance. And you named the ways that we find it in ministry. It's what Dallas called the ABCs of attendance, buildings, cash. Those are the visible signs that say I'm successful, therefore I'm significant, therefore I'm valued. And the systems of this world are built on that. That is why everybody's on a search for significance. But it's ultimately, it doesn't provide the meaning. People get to those proverbial mountaintops and then say, is this all there is? Is this, this is, it's what Emily Dickinson said, fame is a fickle food. You might reach that success, and only to get there and go, wow, this is not, because it's not a need of the soul. Right. That's if the self is a false construct, then you might build that up, but it's not real. And that's why you get there and go, wow, I had all of the, whatever your measures are for significance, and it doesn't. It ends up being that those things that are in our souls, to be loved, to be desired, to be connected to God, to be forgiven, to be made alive, to be a part of an adventure, those needs of the soul, that's how you find genuine significance.
Yeah. And that makes me think, as you describe that you're going back to that practice of holy leisure that you highlighted right up front in this book, that my soul finds rest in the presence of God and my self gets itchy.
Yes.
It gets itchy, it gets restless. It's like, can I just do something? I think Thomas Merton's visual was the self keeps wrapping bandages around itself to somehow keep itself in existence. The bandages are experiences and acquisitions and fame or whatever it is, but it doesn't have any existence. So for me, it's like my itchiness in solitude is a great diagnostic.
That is so, I'm going to use that. It gets itchy. That is so good. That's so descriptive. It's exactly what it is.
And that's why I just think for leaders, the practice of holy leisure and the realization that they are souls, serving souls, is so absolutely critical. It's not a common vision of what ministry is, I don't think.
Right. And that's why I'm so grateful for you, Alan, and for your work, and what you and Jim have been doing is just so fantastic, because it's almost like you're a voice crying in the wilderness, like we need more of your voice out there to say the things that you're saying and teaching and writing.
Well, thank you. I sure appreciate that. Well, Jim, as we sort of come to the close of our conversation, I wonder, would you just maybe share a word of encouragement to our listeners? Many of them are leaders in ministry or nonprofit or other sorts of settings, business, education, whatever. And I think they really need this message, and maybe give them some encouragement along those lines.
Yeah. I would say a couple of things, Alan. One is there's the old joke about the Sunday school class where the teacher asks, what is brown and furry and collects nuts and likes to run around in the trees? And this little boy says, well, it sounds like a squirrel, but I'm going to say Jesus, because that's usually the answer.
Right.
I say that because Jesus actually is the answer to all the needs of your soul. That was the thing. As I began seeing what the needs are, then I realized, oh, wow, the person who created us is also the solution, the answer to those things that we need. In Christ, we find that we are desired and that we are loved and that we are forgiven and all these deep longings. And so the first thing I would say is that it really is Jesus. It really is. And I'll close with this benediction, if you don't mind. But
oh, yeah.
So the book end, I got to the very end of the book, and I just felt like offering a benediction. And so here's what I wrote. It's on page 211 of the book. You are no mere mortal. You are a divinely designed, deeply loved, fully forgiven, fully alive, sacred person with a sacred story of grace, a sacred body, and a holy longing for God. You were perfectly designed before the foundation of this world to do great works that give glory to God. And you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe. You're one in whom Christ dwells and delights, and you will live forever in the strong and unshakable kingdom of God. May you sing and dance with the joy of a child in the knowledge of God's unending love.
Amen. That says it beautifully. Well, I love it. That is such a good word. I hope that our listeners will get a copy of your book. Again, our guest today has been James Bryan Smith, and we've been talking about his latest book, The Good and Beautiful You. Jim, what a pleasure to spend this time with you.
Always great, Alan. Bless you, brother.
Thanks. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.